Hey, LJ, back on the vid in my new house. If you were following it all on some of the social media platforms, I shared that we had an exciting time finding our new house. We'll just say that. So we've landed, and I'm happy to say that we are loving it. Really. Oh my gosh, it's even better than our last place. It's even better part of Long Beach. We already loved where we were, and it got even better. Closer to the Colorado Lagoon. Even more parking, more space, more beautiful house. There's a little construction across the street, so you'll hear that, but they're just like rebuilding an already beautiful house. So super thankful and glad to be back at it with sharing really what I love, what works for me, how I see we can tune ourselves. I had some reason recently to look at more clearly, what am I doing? What am I offering? What am I sharing with all this yoga and meditation stuff especially? And I realized my main message, if you haven't gotten it already, is I love to say tune you, right? That's how I like to see all these videos under one show that you might call tune you. But really, when it gets down to it, it's about us seeing how we can use these practices, perspectives, and psychology to tune ourselves, which we see can mean so many things, right? Like addressing ourselves as energy, tuning our focus and mindset and how important that is. Actually, tuning the body in other ways with helping the musculoskeletal system get what it needs, right? Tuning ourselves in so many ways, right, with these practices. So I am here to help you keep finding more ways to tune you, to keep realizing that it's about you, tuning you, and to share with you ways that I like to tune me, and share with you people even that I see are tuning themselves in ways that are even more about also creativity and passion and purpose, right? So not just feeling better and not even just about health, but about using all of this to tune ourselves to who we are, who we're here to be, to tune ourselves to maybe our more infinite divine parts. Union yoga, I love to share that it just means to join, to connect. Union, but it's not just, it's a big deal when we look at what we're doing with all of this. So I continue to love sharing with you what's working for me along my journey, right? And lately I'm having fun talking about it for the first time really as magic that we're doing, if we like that word magic. And really, especially as we take this system, this belief that it's all energy into account, into accord, into how we're approaching it all. And when we start to realize the power of various tools we have as humans, for instance, right? Like the power of our words, right? What we're saying out loud, what we're writing, what we're thinking, super powerful, especially because it's all energy. And we start to see that our focus is hugely important as humans and has its own energy. And whatever we focus on, we seem to magnify and make stronger or bigger, right? So all of this we get from the yoga and meditation schools and practices, right? And that's why I always include, though, that it's more than just the practices, right? It's the perspectives, it's the psychology that all make it about union, right? Living more from that. So, but also seeing that it's magic that we get to do with ourselves when we realize this, when we start to live like this, when we start to handle ourselves like this, when we start to approach any of our problems with this. So that's really fun and new for me to bring it forth with the word magic and to admit that it is that, right? And to help us play with that. And as I started to think about my next gathering because I'd love to get together with you live when we can, right now in Southern California. I was looking at November, and I realized, or maybe I channeled through this idea aloud, co-created with the universe, to do my next day treat on 11/11. I realized that was coming, and that we could even be together at 11:11 a.m. Right? So it's so fun and so playful and so powerful and so magical, right? So it's my excuse to even more talk about with you the magic of these practices, right? The magic of these perspectives, the psychology, all of it, the magic of the union lifestyle and how it tunes us, right? And tunes our lives, right? And is like magic, basically, right? It's owning the fact that we are the magic in our lives, right? In so many ways. And we see that the yogis have been talking about all these pieces the whole time. They were never just talking about the body, for instance. There's always been the talk of the mindset and the mind and the focus and the imagination and the understanding it all as energy. All of that, right, is part of the yoga as it has been expressed up till now. So, this first thing I wanted to talk about today with sharing the magic of these practices is this idea, which is kind of counterculture, even though our culture is all about these things, seemingly, we kind of rebel against it, right? But it's this idea of pleasure being a good idea. And interestingly, this came up for me twice in the last week through my work with people and my being out in the world just learning and being at events and such. So one was a client who's kind of a woman who I think is probably around 70 years old, who's got an amazing mindset and focus, although she is working with her own stuff in life. And she was saying that in her classes that she was going to for mental health at Kaiser, which is a medical system here in California. I don't know if it's other states, but so in going to Kaiser for their classes that they're offering the community, even on how to handle your own depression and things like that. But probably it's the classes that the doctors who are prescribing meds for some people also are suggesting for their patients. So this is like mainstream medicine. She was saying, because I guess this came up in one of our yoga therapy sessions, because she's also using the exercises and some of the practices and some of the journaling and things now she sees for things like her feelings of depression lately in life. But she was saying at the Kaiser classes, they were talking about pleasure. They were talking about how we now know that one of the ways to, I'm figuring I'm going to take it to the next step, that they were talking about part of taking care of our mental health, right? Much less boosting our mental health, how we're feeling in our emotions in our lives, is doing more things that we realize bring us pleasure. Isn't that interesting? So I feel like it's just super interesting because in a sense it seems like our culture is all about pleasure, right? In a way, right? In this sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing, especially here in the West. But a lot of us maybe don't look to pleasure as a way to feel better or to get through stuff, or as a practice, or as a mindset. So I thought that was so interesting to hear that at these Kaiser classes that this woman, this 7-year-old woman, it was going to for her, with her doctor's recommendation, was talking about pleasure and recommending that as a way to shift the way these people are feeling in their bodies, in their minds, in their mental health, right? With their diagnoses even. I thought that was so amazing to hear that that's crossed over now to that kind of system that's seemingly so mainstream, right? And medicine. But yeah, that maybe pleasure, what brings us pleasure, has its own medicine. That's so cool to think and realize, and then to see that have the yogis always known this. And that's where I have been such a fan of our personalizing all of this along the way, because even within the practices, as we realize the ones that really personally work for us, whether it's the poses that work for us and maybe bring us more towards pleasure, we could say, or all the other tools, right? The journaling, the walking, the nature, the breath, the sound, all the things that are part of the yoga. That the more that we personalize it, the better it seems to work. And so that's interesting that also at Kaiser, they're saying, figure out what brings you pleasure and do more of that. To like a 70-year-old woman who's looking to find more purpose in her life, to create more direction, to love her life more, to shift her mental health, do more of what brings you pleasure, right? Like, isn't that weird that that's like radical advice for us in this seemingly pleasure-driven culture? Somehow we've forgotten that that is actually important to do, right? And I know even with me, I'll see things that I know I love, I do, that I love that I do, that I can do, that I actually don't do very much, right? Like hiking. I know I love hiking, and I do a lot of walking, but I don't do that much hiking. And every time I do, I'm always saying like, gosh, I need to hike more. I love this so much. So it's just interesting. Then I'll kind of once in a while realize like, gosh, how much different and happier would I be if I was hiking more, right? How many more good ideas would I be having? How much different would I be feeling in my life if I was hiking more? If that's something I realize that brings me pleasure, right? So I see that with myself too, that somehow I have thought it's like noble or honorable or something to deprive myself of some of the things that I know bring me pleasure. And then the other place that I heard about pleasure was being at something that maybe you'd even more expect to hear it, but at my friend Kim Summers Egglesey's High Vibe Soul Sisters event in Huntington Beach, where there were a few amazing speakers that are all friends of mine, teaching and speaking about things like intuition and living more of an aligned life and things like that. And that's my basic way of saying it, but some of those teachers talking about maybe even a more feminine way too. Maybe this is even interesting for us as women, or people who are just embracing more of a feminine approach. And that includes, instead of pushing through a problem, this is from Monique Halm, a friend and teacher I love, we would pleasure through. So to know to even take like pleasure breaks in our days as a way to handle ourselves and rewire ourselves and refresh ourselves and tune ourselves, right? So whatever that may be. Could be like a cup of tea, right? Or a walk, or a shower, or a nap, or a phone call, or taking time to draw, and I'm sure with food, that's probably part of how it's supposed to be too, right? I realize, because I'm thinking like, to me it's pleasurable to like eat or have snacks, but then so many of us that becomes an issue. but probably that's part of how food can be too, right? As a pleasure thing. So just super interesting to consider pleasure as a tool. And then maybe part of a yogi meditative approach would be to just, the more that we're doing, to kind of be in touch with ourselves and realize what is bringing us pleasure so that we know more to do that we're even more in that noticing place of how it feels when we do it, more intentional with how we are using our days, right? What we are doing, instead of continuing to having days of like, God, I had another terrible day, and oh yeah, I meant to do this, and I have a sense if I did more of this, I'd feel better. It's like, me too. How would we feel if we did a little more of those things? Maybe it's that simple, that bring us pleasure. As a magical thing to do, though. Like, I think I'll close this up talking about that if we think about it as a vibrational thing too, right? And my last book was called Feel Better Now, so I guess I was on this track, right? That there's some power to helping ourselves move towards feeling better, partly because that's our indicator that our vibration is raising, right? And maybe we're letting go of resistance. That always seems to go with relaxing for me. I don't know about you. But yeah, maybe this idea of pleasure as a tool and a medicine in various ways. And yeah, of course we might think, do you mean sexual pleasure? And I know for sure that's a power too, right? That a lot of us could play with a lot more. Maybe especially as a feminine approach, right? So yeah, that too perhaps. However that may come about, right? So interesting, yeah. Today, in this idea of the magic of these tools, the magic of these practices, perspectives, and psychology is this idea that now even Kaiser Permanente is teaching to their 70-year-old patients who are looking for help with their mental health, right? They're even telling them pleasure. Turns out it's important to do things that we like. Right? It's so interesting that we need that lesson even within this seemingly such indulgent culture, right? But then maybe it's about really looking at what we're doing that we think brings us pleasure, and is it really bringing us pleasure, right? Probably that's some of it too. If we think Netflix brings us pleasure, which I'm all for, often I think Netflix has its own purpose, right? When we binge a show, it's totally its own meditation and is helpful and it has its own therapy, and I think it's super fun to indulge that when it seems to be right in our lives, right? But then there seems to be times, right, where we might use something like Netflix that doesn't leave us feeling all inspired and refreshed or renewed or therapized or whatever, right? So maybe that's the power of the awareness that we're having through it, to look at what we're choosing, and does that fit in the pleasure category like I think it does, or does it actually not? That's where probably food's a good example, right? That we think some foods might bring us pleasure, but then later if it makes us feel terrible, then we may start to even rewire the idea of that as pleasurable, right? So yeah, I just think that's super interesting that both the new agey goddess high vibe community and the totally mainstream helping the most general of people over at Kaiser are talking about pleasure as something that's important, something to use, and especially if we're really struggling. If we're really struggling to find happiness, they're saying, go do something that's pleasurable. It's no longer we should do more things that are pleasurable, especially if you're struggling, which, maybe it seems like a lot of us are, at least sometimes, right? And then, if we can maybe encourage the people we love too, not be judging if they're doing things, maybe encourage them to do what's pleasurable for them, knowing that that's going to be medicine for them, right? And a magic, so pleasure as a magical tool of all this. So anyways, okay, I'm going to close it up now, and thanks for our time and attention is so huge, and I'm honored. Right. Super cool. All right, more magic to come. Thanks for being here. Adios.